Chad, thank you again for joining me here. This time on Testing Insights, I want to geek out with you around tooling and A/B testing tooling, specifically platform versus third party, building your own platform versus getting a third party. Do you build something or do you buy something in order to solve your problems around A/B testing and gathering data, doing kind of intervention, statistical decision making, so to speak? Introduce yourself for the people that might not know you or watching this. Why are you relevant to talk about this subject in particular? Maybe a little bit of background relevant to the topic. I know you geek out about it even more than I do. I'm just new to this topic, so just a brief introduction. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks for having me on again, Ben. So my name is Chad Sanderson. Right now, I lead the data platform team at a late stage startup called Convoy, based out in Seattle. Data platform is a end-to-end data infrastructure team. And so we include everything from collecting the data, instrumentation, storing the data in a data warehouse, and using the data. So we own our internal machine learning system and also our internal experimentation system as well. Prior to this, I was working with Ronnie Kohavi on Microsoft's experimentation platform team, so an internal team. And then before that, I was at Subway and Sephora, and we were leveraging Adobe Target pretty heavily. So I was the product owner for both of those two technologies. And then prior to that, I was working at Oracle for the Maximizer team, working for the third-party solution. So I've seen it from pretty much every possible angle on experimentation, building it yourself, buying it, and being a vendor. So I think I can speak to when you do one or the other.
I've got a framework, Chad, that I want to share here. I want to share my screen here in a second. It's a arbitrary framework, but it's an effort for me to put into boxes this idea of like, what is more appropriate, working with third parties as a marketing team, or building your own platform as a product team, or as a team that is looking to do more sophisticated analyses and do more sophisticated types of testing. I've got a platform. I want to share that, but I'm inspired to ask you a quick question though. Do you have experience in the hybrid approach? So for example, when you were at Subway or working with Maximizer, was there another team that also had their own product? The reason I ask this is that when we jump into the framework, we might see some business cases for that hybrid approach, having one team use a third party while another team is doing different types of questions and analyses using their own platform.
When I was working at Subway and Sephora, I was actually hired to bring experimentation to the company. So A/B testing was so early that they hadn't got to that point of bifurcation where the engineering team maybe realized that the third-party software wasn't satisfying their needs and then built their own thing. That hadn't happened yet. But those types of conversations, by the tail end of my time there, those conversations were starting to develop. And I've definitely seen it in other places as well, many other places. At Microsoft, it was the case. Microsoft had an internal tool, and there's a lot of teams that's using Adobe and Optimizely.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Let me share my screen real quick so we can look at this framework that I've got that I'm playing with right now to just help facilitate this kind of conversation. So you can see right here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, so I'm not going to get into presentation mode, but just generally walking through this one slide here that speaks to the program tooling approaches. I've got three buckets, and here are kind of some information on the three buckets. One that's quite customer focused, one that's product focused. So you see, customer focused. I'm putting this in the camp of the marketing teams. One product focused, product teams, and then business, operations focused, business logic and such. And you can see some differences in here: customer behavior focused here, feature focused in the product side, and then core business logic focused over here. The tools, as you alluded to, sometimes with the marketing teams, again, I'm biased in this, but where we're working as an agency is generally over here, teams that are not as sophisticated to do their own platform. And so I work quite a bit over here with marketing teams that are using these third-party tools. They're doing traditional testing versus, product teams that are more full stack, feature flagging and such, and custom platform. From input from you previously, I've also added this section down below that speaks to the different kind of core components of like what these testing programs, platforms do, whether it's third party or not, the three core functions of assignment, dealing with metrics, and dealing with the analysis. And some do them better than others, or different ways than others, just depending on the problems that are being addressed, right? If the problem's about users, then the assignment is about users and sessions. If it's a problem or question about shipments, then the assignment might be on shipments or something like that. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second. One of my first questions for you is just about this framework generally. Is there something missing? Is there something to add on to it? But I don't want to harp on this explicitly. So I'm going to stop sharing and just go back to the conversation. So first question, back over to you. What are you thinking about that kind of setup and that rubric, that way of thinking? Is it missing something? For example, I think it's missing like SEO testing, for example. Where does that happen? Is there a third party there? There's some components that should be there that are not. But what are your thoughts just generally on that?
Yeah. So really what you're describing in the first section where you lay out the marketing use case, the product use case, and the business use cases, you're talking about decision science and different slices of decision science. You can do decision science for marketing changes, decision science for product changes, decision science for like operations. To your point, you can do it for SEO. You can do it for anything. You can do it for all types of anything that requires a change in the real world, whether it's a product feature or human beings making some alteration to an existing process. All of those have some mechanism to analyze the change, understand the impact, and report the results. And I sort of categorize all of that as decision science. So I think that's really what you're describing, and it can be way more expansive, right? You can include pretty much anything, any division at a company that needs to make a change and analyze the impact of it. So,
focusing on the left of the spectrum, kind of diving in there and thinking about circling back to the question of buy versus build and the third-party tools. As I mentioned, my bias is that the marketing team, the decision science that needs to be done there is really well facilitated by these third-party tools, these lower code solutions that end up speeding up the flywheel. You mentioned at Microsoft, there were teams that had their work on the platform. There were a bunch of other teams that I guess were using third-party tools because it sped up their flywheel of decision science, right? So can you kind of speak to when that changes? So like when do you see that third-party tools enhancing, but then eventually inhibiting that flywheel? And is there some kind of turnover point? Is it when marketing and products start to get closer in bed with each other or something like that?
I think it is. I think that change, that cutover point happens, it can happen in like 2 or 3 primary points. The time where it's really good to use third-party software to do marketing style experiments, I think, is when you're just introducing the concept of experimentation to a culture, to a new business. Like they really haven't heard of it before. It's not something they normally do. They don't really even think about analyzing the impact of marketing changes in that way. And so when you come in with a tool and that tool is really easy to get set up, it's one line of JavaScript, any engineer can do it. It doesn't take that long to add new metrics. Then the barrier to entry for running experiments is very low. So you can get started doing really easy tests. And generally speaking, this is how a lot of companies get started. It's like, let's just try seeing how easy it is to change a button color or change some text on a page or add an image or something. And once the team gets familiar with that workflow and it's really, really simple, then they can start incorporating experimentation like deeper into their culture. But I think that there are some major downsides to that process. And the first one is, even when it comes to the experiments that are more customer oriented, operating at this sort of JavaScript beacon level can be damaging. And it can be negative if you build the culture based around that. One reason is because the impacts of changing the user experience is not just limited to what's happening in the app. If you make it way easier to buy something or you change an algorithm, the intention is that you should be making the company money. So there's a revenue impact, and ideally there's a margin impact. And it's really hard to actually start collecting those metrics accurately if all you're using is the JavaScript beacons and sort of collecting event data from the front end. It's really, really hard to do that. So that's one sort of tipping point, is when people don't want to limit their analysis of marketing style experiments to what's going on in the application, either because you just don't have all the data, the data might be wrong, or do you want to be able to join it on some like other interesting entity that exists? Like we want to understand how this impacts like call volume or something, and we don't have access to that. So that's one tipping point. The other tipping point is when people start to think beyond the customer. And I wouldn't really say it's a maturity stage. It's just, what does the business care about? So Convoy has a few important concepts outside of a customer that's really critical: a shipment, an RFP, a bid, an offer, an email. You could even say sort of an internal employee, like one of our operations representatives. All of these concepts are really critical to the business functioning, and we're consistently deploying features and process changes that are intended to benefit those particular entities. So if we want to conduct decision science there, we can't use this framework of everything exists in the app and just emit a JavaScript beacon. We're not able to do that. Now we have to think about services. We just need to think about things that the front end doesn't really care about. And depending on what the business focus is, that conversation can either happen very, very early. So in Convoy's case, it happened at the beginning. So we never even went in the direction of the third-party application because that was sort of the driving force of experimentation, or it can happen much later. And that's when you see that bifurcation you were talking about earlier, where you have the marketing team that's using one tool and the engineering team that's using another one.
Yeah, so to summarize that, the two tipping points that you identified, one is when you start to go downstream with I wrote down metrics of the implications of what you're changing around on the front end. That's kind of not an elegant way to say what you said, but downstream metrics. The other one is there's other objects and indices besides what's available on the front end, right? When you start playing around there, you start to have to deal with other solutions. Okay, cool. So let me push you though on the hybrid approach, because you mentioned, Microsoft having a hybrid approach, and you mentioned, when teams want to go beyond, culturally when they're setting up. But Microsoft, in theory, is an experimentation culture, yet there are still teams that might not live in that culture as fully, or they might not be needing to take advantage of addressing, getting close to those two tipping points, for example. Mm-hmm. In these hybrid situations, is there a place for that to live permanently? Or do you think that on the horizon for every company is a custom platform? So there's there's an implicit gap right now, and we're just all bridging that gap. Or can we live in that state, right? There's companies that are just experimentation first, Netflix and Airbnb and Booking and Convoy. Like you said, they started from the beginning. But there's also everyone else, right? All these other companies that are operating in culturally very different ways, can't start over, or if they did, would require insane amounts of change management. But is it on the horizon ultimately? Can you make the argument that all companies are going to go towards a single unified platform within their organization?
That's a great question. I think that all companies will go to a single unified platform, but I don't think that that single unified platform is going to be internal. The reason that Microsoft and Amazon and Google all built their own system is because in order to run experiments at the data warehouse level, which is what you need in order to have access to all the different entity types, all the different metrics, you have to exist at the source data foundation. You have to be able to parse that data. You have to be able to build metrics on that. You have to be able to understand when a particular entity has been assigned a certain experience and do all the stitching to match all that stuff together. And then you have to be able to apply statistics on top of that data. The infrastructure cost to set all of that up is enormous. And the bigger the company, the Google, Microsoft, the bigger the cost in setting up that infrastructure. So to talk about Microsoft's platform for just a little bit, our team was composed of around 110 people, 40 data scientists, like 60 engineers, 10 program managers. And our primary function during the day was just making sure that all of our biggest customers like Bing and Microsoft Office and Teams were able to run metrics at the scale that they needed to, because they had so much data and it was so expensive. And it was much less about the user experience and more about running the infrastructure. And the cost of doing that was just so great that a lot of the use cases that marketing needs, we weren't able to build into our product. We said, we're going to take on what we do well, which is running the infrastructure, that focusing on that sort of 80-20 rule. And marketing is like, well, you guys don't have something that we can use. The infrastructure stuff is really cool, but I want to be able to really easily change words on a page, because as a marketer, my focus is like experimenting really rapidly with copy. I'm not necessarily making the largest infrastructure changes in the world. So even though I could benefit from the system you have, it's not actually my critical use case. So that's basically what's happened at most of the big companies, is you had this like investment in an infrastructure platform, and people just said, well, we can kind of go two directions. We can either go the direction of like making this a really, really excellent infrastructure tool, or we can make it a great marketing tool. And 99% of all companies go in the former direction. But there's not really that much that fundamentally separates both sides other than the features. It's just the features are different. And if you have some tool that decides to invest in both features, then there's no reason it can't be one tool. And I think we are going to start to see that.
Awesome. Thanks, Chad. Just to recap those three kind of questions, even for myself as much as you, for closing last words. Your experience on the hybrid solution, on the build versus buy, what were the tipping points on going, from a third party to your own platform? And then do we think that there's a, inevitable unified platform down the road, and whether that's, always in-house or third party? So those were the three questions. Thanks. Any last words on the topic, or? Yeah.
The only last word that I would add is, whenever you're entering into a company that's new to experimentation, or you're thinking about what to do next, start from the most important use cases to the business. Oftentimes, teams will think that there's a tool that exists and I need to map that tool to the use cases. But instead, you should say, where would experimentation have the biggest bang for its buck? And if it would be experimenting on something, in Convoy's case, would be shipments, then that's how you make the decision about where you want to invest, whether you need something internal, whether you need something external. So that would be my big recommendation, is start from use cases, not from tooling.
Yeah, so don't be solutionist. Think about focusing on the problem. A/B testing or testing just generally is beautiful in that it's the joint kind of problem of asking the question, gathering data, and doing the analysis kind of at the same time, that joint thing. So yeah, cool. Thanks, Chad. I appreciate this kind of rapid fire back and forth. Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks, man.
Thanks, Ben.